Escape North, the story of Harriet Tubman. Chapter 1, Escape North. The night was dark. Cricket songs filled the air. A woman hid outside a cabin. She whistled a song called Go Down Mouse. A line in the song said, Let my people go. Inside the cabin, the slaves knew that Harriet Tubman had come to lead her people out of slavery. It was 1851. Harriet Tubman was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't a real railroad. It was the name people gave the route taking slaves north to freedom. Years before, a slave had run off. He had seemed to disappear right in front of his owner's eyes. He must have gone on an underground railroad, said the owner. The story spread. There was a way north to the free states. There were people who would help. They would hide you in their homes. These safe houses were stations on the Underground Railroad. Runaways ran from station to station until they reached the state where slavery was against the law. That Saturday night, 10 slaves answered Harriet's call to freedom. Field slaves had Sundays off, so the bossman wouldn't know what they were. No, they were gone until Monday. Then he and his dogs would come after them. Then they were caught and would be beaten, maybe to death. Harriet was there to make sure that didn't happen. She kept her eyes on one star in the sky, the North Star. She moved quickly, and the runaways followed. Suddenly, the clouds covered the star. Harriet had to make sure she was heading in the right direction. If she didn't, they would end up back at the plantation. Harriet ran her fingers over the bark of the tree nearest her. Daddy Ben had taught her that moss grew on the north side of the trees. I'll have to find north the way my daddy taught me, she thought. Harriet closed her eyes and thought back to the lessons long ago. She thought back to when she was a girl. Chapter 2, Born a Slave. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross in about 1820. As a child, she was called Minty. Later, she took the name Harriet after her mother, who was called Old Rit. Harriet was born a slave on a tobacco plantation in Maryland. She and her family were the property of a man named Edward Brodens. That meant they had little say over their own lives. They could be even sold and separated from each other. Harriet's family lived in a small cabin near the master's house. It had no windows and only a bare earth floor. The family slept on beds made of straw. They used rags or blankets. They didn't have much to eat. Harriet didn't go to school. Slaves weren't allowed to learn to read or write. Instead, she helped her mother cook. She carried buckets of water to the slaves working in the fields. She picked insects of tobacco plants. When Harriet was 7, she was sent to work for a neighbor, Mrs. Cook. Mrs. Cook made Harriet yarn all day. Sometimes the yarn broke. Then Mrs. Cook got out a whip. "You stupid girl," she yelled. "I'll show you what real work is." Mrs. Cook sent Harriet to work for Mr. Cook. Day after day, Harriet stood in the swamp, checking musket traps. Finally, she got sick, and Mrs. Cook took her home. When she was well, Mr. Ross sent her into the tobacco fields. In the fields, slaves worked long hours in the hot sun. They didn't work fast enough. They were beaten. It didn't seem fair to Harriet. Sometimes she looked up at the sky and watched the birds flying north. She promised herself that one day she too would fly north to freedom. Chapter 3. The Accident. When Harriet was a teenager, a slave working in the fields ran off. The boss ran to wait at him to stop him, but it hit Harriet instead. Harriet wasn't the same after that. She fell asleep without a warning. Sometimes her head would drop in the middle of a sentence and she would be asleep. These sleeping spells made escape even more dangerous, but Harriet's mind wasn't made up. Daddy Ben, her father, knew Harriet would run. He wanted her to make it when she did. He showed Harriet where to hide in the woods. He showed her which plants and berries were safe to eat. He taught her how to run quickly and silently through the forest. Most important, he taught Harriet how to find north. "See that big dipper in the sky?" said Daddy Ben one evening. Harriet picked out the stars that form a dipping ladle. "See that bright star above the bowl?" asked Daddy Ben. "That's the North Star. Follow it and you'll be heading towards freedom." Chapter 4. Harriet Escapes. Years went by. Whenever Harriet lost heart, she looked up at the North Star. When she was 28, Harriet fell in love with John Tubman. Slaves weren't allowed to marry, so they jumped the broom instead. A broom was laid on the floor. The couple jumped over it. When they landed, they were husband and wife. Harriet told John her plan to escape. "I have a right to freedom or death," she said. "I will have one or the other." "Silence. No one is going to bring me back alive." John didn't want trouble. He said he would tell Mr. Rhodes if Harriet kept talking about running away. Harriet stopped talking about it, but she didn't stop thinking about it. One day, Harriet found out that she had been sold. It was time to act. Weeks before, a Quaker woman had offered to help. Quakers are religious people who believed that owning other human beings was wrong. The woman gave Harriet directions to a safe house in Delaware, the next state over. The next Saturday, Harriet waited until John was asleep. She wrapped cornbread and salt herring in a handkerchief. She silently opened the cabin door. Outside, the North Star pointed the way. Harriet didn't look back. She took off into the woods, running fast. Chapter 5. Free at last. Harriet ran for hours, sharp pains stabbing her sides. But she didn't stop. She followed the Choptank River to the Maryland border. As she ran, Harriet remembered Daddy Ben's words. Walk through water when you can. The dogs will lose your scent. Harriet took off her shoes and stepped into the icy river. When the sun rose, she heard the baying of the hounds. The bossman was on her trail. Harriet found a small island in the swamp. She hid in a hollow log. She was so tired she fell asleep. She didn't hear the slave catchers galloping past. In Camden, Delaware, Harriet found the safe house the Quaker woman had told her about. A brightly covered quilt hung on the clothesline. That meant it was safe for Harriet to knock. The owners welcomed Harriet into their home. They fed her. They hid her in the attic, where she slept all day. When night came, Harriet thanked them and ran off the next safe house. Once, Harriet fell asleep on the road. She woke up just as a group of slave hunters were approaching. Harriet scrambled into a ditch and covered herself with mud. She prayed the hunters won't see her. Somehow they never did. After days of running, Harriet crossed into the free state of Pennsylvania. She looked at her hands. She was the same person, but something about her hand had changed. Her hands belonged to her now, not to anyone else. Harriet Tubman was free. In Philadelphia, Harriet found a room to rent. She found work as a cook in a hotel. One day, she met a man named William Steele. He was the secretary of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Harriet went to the society's secret meetings. One night at the meeting, Harriet found out her sister's family has escaped. They were hiding in Baltimore. They needed someone to lead them to safety. I will lead them, said Harriet. The men at the meeting were shocked. There were no women conductors on the Underground Railroad. It was too dangerous. But Harriet would not be swayed. She was going to free her people, just like Moses in the Bible. Chapter 6. No turning back. That first trip has been long ago. Harriet remembered it now as she felt the moss on the trees. She had made it then. She would make it again. This way, she told the runaways. Finally, the group reached a safe house, but the station master wouldn't let them in. He was afraid to the Fugitive Slave Act. Fugitive Slave Act. The new law said that anyone helping runaways could be severely punished. Harry led the group back into the woods. Everyone was tired and hungry. One woman was so weak that Harriet had to carry her. Suddenly, one of the men stopped. "I'm going back," he said. "It's better to be a slave than suffer like this." Harriet stood in his way. If the slave catchers caught him, they would beat the secrets of the Underground Railroad out of him. Harriet couldn't let that happen. She pointed her gun at the man. "You run back or you'll never run again," she said. "Come with me, or now or die." The group trudged on. Finally, they found a safe house in the Wilmington, Delaware. A Quaker man, Thomas Garrett owned a shoe store. He had a secret room for runaways to hide in behind a wall of shoe boxes. When the runaways were ready to leave, he gave them each a pair of shoes. When they reached Philadelphia, William Steele gave Harriet money to take the group on to Canada. He wrote in his journal, "Harriet Tubman is not afraid. The idea that she could be caught at any time doesn't seem to enter her mind." Chapter 7. Saving Daddy Ben and Old Rit. Daddy Ben and Old Rit were now in their 70s. Running would be hard for them, but Harriet wanted her parents to know freedom. In 1857, she went back to Maryland dressed as an old woman. Daddy Ben and Old Rit were overjoyed to see her. Harriet took an old horse and wagon from nearby Platishon. That night, Daddy Ben and Old Rit climbed into the back of the wagon. Harriet covered them with blankets. She drove the horse as fast as she could. She wanted to be out of Maryland by daybreak. In Delaware, a Quaker railroad again sold them train tickets. Daddy Ben and Old Rit could hardly believe it. They had been slaves all their lives. Now Harriet was using Daddy Ben's lessons to bring them to freedom. Chapter 8. Harriet's last year. In 1861, the Civil War broke out. President Abraham Lincoln wanted to free the slaves. President Abraham Lincoln. But the southern states were against this. One by one, they left the Union. They formed a union on their own, called the Confederacy. The war tore the country apart. As always, Harriet was quick to join the fight. She worked as a spy and a scout for the North. She also worked as a nurse. In 1865, the North won the Civil War. The Underground Railroad stopped running. The fight to free the slaves were over. Harriet spent her later years in Auburn, New York, taking care of her parents. After many years, the government decided to give her a reward for her work. She used the money to build a home for elderly blacks who had no place to live. In 1913, Harry became too sick to get out of bed. Visitors read the newspaper to her. She followed the news of women fighting for the right to vote. She sent them a message: stand together. It was a message that had helped her people win the victory of slavery. One day, it would help women win the vote. Harriet died at the age of 93. She had made at least 19 trips south and brought more than 300 people out of slavery. I've never run a train off the track, and I've never lost a passenger, she liked to say. Today, Harriet Tubman is remembered as the Moses of her people, and one of the bravest soldiers in the fight against slavery. The end.